to start setting up the presentation. I think Andrea will go first, then it will be Monica, and then it will be myself. So thank you everybody for being here, and I will not take any more of your time. Andrea, you can take it.
Yes, so you see in the screen, right? Okay, cool. So I also don't want to take too much time. I guess we have like 20 minutes or so, right?
I think we have more because there's just 3 of us. So
okay, cool.
to be exact, I think you have until 12:40.
Okay,
so Eastern Standard Time.
Okay, cool. So thank you very much for having the paper in the conference. So this is a joint work with Valentin Lang and David Mihaly. And it's a paper in which we look at the effect of debt relief on sovereign borrowing costs. So it's an empirical paper. You know, I'm with the IMF, so the usual disclaimer applies, are my own views and not the view of the fund and IMF policy. So the motivation is that, you know, even before COVID, like public debt was on the rise in a number of low-income and developing countries. It increased by something about 27-30% to more than 45% of GDP in the last 10 years, and you know, it increased even much more in the reaction of the pandemic. And so this induced a number of people, like from academics to policymakers, to talk about risk of a deadly debt crisis, as mentioned in a paper by Christina Rayyan and co-authors. And on the other hand, like the effect of the pandemic is that, you know, global poverty is going to increase for the first time in 20 years, and real GDP growth kind of collapsed in developing countries. Like at the time where we were writing, the expectation for GDP to contract by more than 1% in 2020, with a downward revision of about 6%. So this is the scenario, and in this kind of scenario, so I'm putting myself in early 2020, the decision of there was a lot of discussion in the international community about how to deal with sort of the crisis in developing countries, and especially in the fact that those countries has to pay and service debt in a moment in which it's clearly non-affordable. And so I guess this is the sort of the trade-off is clear in this quotation by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, saying that the dilemma is stark. Do we continue to pay towards debt, or we should redirect resources to save lives and livelihoods? And the response of sort of this trade-off in discussion, there was this initiative by the G20 to provide debt relief in terms of suspension of debt repayment due or 2020. But then what is also kind of puzzling is that, and then here we have a quotation from the Treasury Secretary of Kenya, saying that the G20 debt relief initiative does not offer optimal benefits, and we fear we might unnecessarily create a crisis. So even though there was a sort of a potential possibility of countries to buy in and get moratorium of debt relief, some of those countries did not take that because they say they could signal that it could trigger a crisis later on. So starting from these facts, our paper look exactly at this initiative, which is called the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which provides, as I said, debt service to a number of eligible countries from bilateral lenders for about 3 years. The Debt Service Initiative provides quite large liquidity injection, in the sense that the amount of debt service due in 2020, which can be postponed by 3 years, is non-trivial. We're talking about more than $10 billion US. And if you put in perspective, it's about 1/5, about 20-25% of the fiscal shortfall due to COVID-19 shock, and clearly with a lot of variation across countries. So we want to study that initiative. And at the beginning, we were puzzled by the fact that some countries buy in and so participate in the initiative, and some others did not participate in the initiative. And so this was the sort of the key question for us. So why some countries were reluctant to join the DSSI, and even nowadays, some countries still did not join the initiative. And we think this is sort of a puzzle response to what, at least at first sight, seems to be like free money on the table in time of great needs. And so we start looking at what could
Sorry,
be
sorry, Andrea, I have a clarifying
yes.
question. Are there any strings attached to the program?
Yeah, I come to that. The
Okay.
program actually doesn't have too many strings attached. It's really free money on the table, but the quotation here is that generally, at least if you go back and look at the reaction by public officials, and even more important from the market, like rating agencies, what really kind of pushed some countries not to buy in was stigma effect. The fact that, if you join, you say, my country is not doing so well, and so maybe sovereign spread could actually increase. So our question is,
sorry, do you have a way of disentangling between the stigma effect and the I don't want to actually do the reforms that will be the strings attached with this money?
Yes, what we do in the paper, we try, first of all, we want to document what happens to the spreads. In a sense, if there is stigma, spreads should go up. It's a liquidity provision, spreads should go down. Then I'll try to convince you that there are no strings attached. The key strings attached is the fact that you have to have an IMF lending program. And so we will show that you can do some sort of exercise in which we look at countries which have an IMF lending program but are not part of the DSSI, and you see that nothing happens to spread. So that's our way to disentangle the two. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. But the first key question is we want to look at if this provision of debt relief from the official sector, which are bilateral lender that bilateral and multilateral lender that provide that service suspension, can have any effect, any spillover effect on private bond market, meaning sovereign borrowing cost goes up and down. And so the question is, how did sovereign bond spread react to the DSSI? And I guess theoretically you can have different stories. If you have like a very simple frictionless setting, and if you assume that the debt relief is NPV neutral, this is sort of a technical issue. It's tricky in the sense that it's argued in official document it is NPV neutral. You can make a case that it's not NPV neutral, but it's close to that. So in that scenario, you should have nothing happening on spread. But then you can think about two different stories. The one that I was saying is that participation may signal debt vulnerabilities. On top of that, even the fact that you have a postponement of debt service can simply create spikes in debt service down the road. And this sort of reprofiling can make debt sustainability more complicated for some countries. And so sovereign spread should increase right now. And so these spikes are very important because we're talking about frontier market, which basically finance themselves in the market with Eurobonds, which are with bullet repayment at the end. And so some of those countries, a lot of repayment due in 2023, 2024, 2025. So if you postpone repayment today, in 3 years' time, you're making repayment in 2024 even more complicated. And so market can anticipate that, and sovereign spread could go up now. The third story is the liquidity provision effect. So if you provide a significantly large liquidity injection, that could restore market confidence and reduce the risk of the distress in the future. Especially, if countries are able to use some of this money now to mitigate the crisis, so maybe the recovery could be somewhat faster. Again, think about it. We're thinking this is April 2020. We didn't know how the COVID was playing out in developing countries. We didn't know about vaccines having different sort of quickness in being provided in different parts of the world. At the time, the crisis was much more for advanced emerging economies, like frontier markets were not much affected by the virus at the time. And so maybe one can think that liquidity provision could actually help to mitigate the crisis, and therefore spread should fall. So basically what we do, we use the DSSI implementation as a plausible exogenous shock. We do synthetic control methods. So basically we compare countries which are eligible with a donor pool of countries which are not eligible at DSSI to build a counterfactual and look at the evolution of daily sovereign bond spreads around the policy announcement. So the DSSI activation in May is the treatment. We do synthetic control to create a counterfactual, and we argue that the DSSI, being a response to a COVID shock, is clearly exogenous, and this sort of allow us to sort of contribute to literature on sovereign debt restructuring, where generally restructuring is by definition endogenous, and here we have an episode in which instead the restructuring is exogenous. So as I said, we build on different literature. The key one is the one on sovereign debt restructuring, and that literature has more recently moved beyond binary treatment of restructuring events. And here we look at a specific case in which basically there is official restructuring provided, and we look at the effect on the private sector. There is also literature on more on development side. They look at sovereign debt relief going back to the HIPC and MDRI initiative in the 2000, which show some positive market reaction after multilateral debt relief. Was the Brady plan in Latin America, and as I said, HIPC and MDRI. And so we sort of go in that tradition and find evidence which is consistent with what people have found in the past. And more generally, I think we contribute on the literature on heterogeneous creditors, where we look at the effects of private debt market on a specific episode of restructuring and in an episode of official sector debt moratorium, which is close to NPV neutral. So this is the timeline of the events. Everybody knows what happened, and the COVID cases going up. This is our sample of developing countries. So the pandemic arrived late, but the whole discussion started in February and March, and in April 15 there was the announcement of this DSSI, so the provision of debt service postponement, and in May 1st there was implementation of the policy, where the first country actually voted in, which was Pakistan. So May 1st is our treatment. Everything goes through if we use the announcement, but I will show why we do the implementation as our treatment. More specifically, as I said, the DSSI provides a 3-year suspension of principal and interest payment due between March and December 2020. Nowadays, the DSSI has been already renewed, rolled over a couple of times. We ignore that. Our focus is the first shock and what happened in 2020. All the rest is much more, making the claim is the renewal is exogenous. It's very, very difficult. So we really look at the first episode. It only involve official lenders, which is as a sort of caveat in interpreting, and we'll go back to that at the end. The DSSI covers 73 eligible countries, which are sort of a mix of different list of countries, either in the World Bank, LDC, or in the UN. These countries are somewhat heterogeneous in their access to finance and income. So there are some countries which are richer, which are poorer, which are not part of the eligible group, and otherwise. So it's not really clear cut. Eligibility is not conditional on immediate financing needs and debt repayment problem. So there is, and we have some exercise where actually we show that the amount of debt service provided is orthogonal to the health shock, the economic shock, the fiscal shock. The initiative comes with conditions, as Fernando was saying. Couple of are really minor. So use fiscal space to tackle the crisis. We hope that the country should do. Transparency and disclosure, they always come with that. Countries generally don't comply that much. What is really important is the request of IMF financing. This is not much relevant, I would say, because most of the countries already had emergency lending by the fund, and some would have requested anyway. But the point is that for us, it's difficult to disentangle liquidity provision from IMF conditionality, and we have an exercise in which we try to separate out the two. So the research design, we have daily data on sovereign bond spreads for 70 low and middle income countries between January and August 2020. Our sample includes 18 countries which are eligible on the DSSI, which are our treated group, and 52 countries which are in the donor pool. So the point here is that, as I said before, the DSSI covers 73 countries. Our sample is 18, simply because the DSSI covers very poor countries, or poor countries, most of them don't have market access, so there are no data by definition on sovereign bonds. So these 18 are sort of these frontier economies. And so we compare them with similar countries which are middle income, but are not eligible under the DSSI. Clearly, those two groups of countries are different, and that's why we do synthetic control. We also argue that these 18 countries doesn't create a huge selection bias, meaning that they are not too different from the other eligible countries, apart from having market access. But if you look at income per capita, poverty, financial integration, and other macro controls, they are very, very similar. Then we have standard data from IMF Economic Outlook and the World Bank. So this is sort of very descriptive data. So these are sovereign bond spreads for the two group of countries, the treated one, DSSI eligible, and our donor pool, non-DSSI eligible countries. These are normalized at 1 in the announcement period. You can see there is this huge increase in sovereign bond spread in the run-up of the crisis, then they plateau, and then they start to going down after the DSSI. Here it seems that they go down for the two of them, more or less the same pace, but again, we're comparing apples and oranges, and we want to do an apple and apple comparison. But this tells you what actually happening in the market. So identification, as I said, the DSSI, in our view, allow to construct a plausible counterfactual, and it's nice compared to when you study in general the macro effect of data restructuring. That data restructuring is always endogenous to economic condition. Here, DSSI is a response to a global non-economic shock, which is the pandemic crisis. It has been announced simultaneously for all eligible countries, not tailored to the need of an individual country. So if you are close to that distress, or if you have very good fiscal position, you are eligible the same way. Eligibility criteria based on pre-existing income threshold, and as I said, the treatment date is May 1st when DSSI becomes effective, and so actually the country can have this postponement and coincide with the first country, which is actually the largest one of the eligible one participating in the initiative. We use synthetic control, and we do, for inference, we do placebo, then we do synthetic diff and diff, and then we do generalized synthetic control, which are somewhat similar. The intuition is basically they combine a diff and diff setting with synthetic control. So we basically stack all our countries, we construct a panel of countries and their synthetic control, and in that panel we can do diff and diff, and so we can control for country fixed effect, time fixed effect, and so it's, and more importantly, we can have confidence band around our point estimates. And then we do local projection diff and diff to look at heterogeneous responses to try to tease out the mechanisms. So let me skip that. Synthetic control, the intuition is, I guess, all know what you're talking about, but the counterfactual is used projecting the outcome for synthetic control into the post-treatment using the way that we do to construct from the donor pool. And the synthetic and generalized are very, very similar, as I said, allow us to use fixed effect.
Andrea, I have a question. Was a COVID rates part of the variables that you use to construct the control?
Yes, exactly. It's here. So when we control, we match, we do a lot of, we have already revised the paper after one round. So we did like so many possible different ways of doing the matching. The baseline is we match on a large set of pre-treatment characteristics, which are real GDP growth, public debt, fiscal and current account balances, international reserves, which are standard variable that should explain sovereign bond spreads. Most importantly, the share of external debt due to private creditors, because that's a key part, and that explains difference across countries. And this has been like quite an extensive data work, because these data are not easily available for low, especially for some of countries in the sample. So took us quite some time. Then we match on specific date on pre-determined sovereign spread, and the 4 dates are the 4 days used were the key episode done by the WHO, so the declaration of the pandemic and so on and so forth. And then we also match on the number of daily COVID cases per million people, which is sort of an extent of the COVID shock. And then we do a lot of robustness around that. The sample is January, August, so it's 4 months before and 4 months after. The key assumption on the synthetic control are 2. One, no anticipation, meaning that the matching variable should not anticipate the event, and this, should be pretty convincing given the shock that we are studying. The second one is a bit trickier, which is no interference, meaning that the donor pool should not be affected by the event. We know that in the literature on crisis and contagion, there is a lot of contagion in financial markets. The point is that here, for no interference to work, means that we shouldn't be the effect that our treated countries are not affecting the donor pool, which is kind of plausible assumption, meaning that generally all the literature on contagion tells us that there is this global financial cycle from the US to emerging market. There is contagion among emerging markets, but it's very difficult to assume that what happens in Ghana can affect bond spreads in Argentina or in Colombia. So this is basically the assumption. We are assuming that Ghana spreads are not affecting Argentina spreads, but Argentina spreads may affect the Ghana one, which is, I think it's correct. So this is our key result. So as I said, we have these 18 countries. For each of the 18, we construct a synthetic control, and here we plot the median and the interquantile range of these 18 countries, and also the average. You can see there is basically no pre-trend, meaning that we are able to match. So the spread gap, the difference between the aqueous and synthetic, is basically 0 up to the implementation of DSSI. Then started going down, and by the time we are close to the summer, it's around 200 basis points lower than the counterfactual, the synthetic control. So this is basically the main result. What is nice here is that not only the median and the average goes down significantly, but if you plot the 18 lines, that's what we had originally in the paper, none of the 18 lines, none of the 18 spread gap was actually positive. Clearly, there is a lot of variation. Some of the lines are down here, some are very close to here, but they all, the spread gap is always negative. So they all go in the same direction. So as I said, like we do robustness in different things. So for instance, we look at countries included in the donor pool. We exclude like problematic countries, Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador. We also do jackknife. We exclude one country at a time from the donor pool. Results are still there. And also the variables used to construct the synthetic control. We mentioned the average per treatment. We control for the extent of the COVID shock, so the change in death growth projection. We do a balanced table between the treated countries and the donor pool. The clearly difference, because clearly the donor pool are richer countries and so on and so forth. So we match on all the variables which are different between the treated and the donor pool. We control for sovereign credit ratings. Results are still there. They're all in the paper. We have different versions of this chart. We do the announcement as a treatment, and again, same stuff. What happens, there is a lot of volatility here because there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. But then again, if you start looking at by mid-May, spreads goes down consistently across countries. To do inference, we do different falsification tests. First of all, we backdate in March 2nd, 2020. And again, we do the exercise. Here, there is, given the lot of volatility, you see that the spread gap is not 0, but it doesn't go in the same direction. It goes up and down, but then it goes down again after the implementation. And instead, like clearly is 0 before that. Then we do a backdating in 1 year before, and again, nothing before and 0 whatsoever after. That tells us that our way of matching is not specific to the COVID, but it's a good way of building steady control also in normal times, and we know no results. Then we do in-space placebo. So here we treat the 18 poorest countries in the donor pool. So then become our treated countries, and then all the other become the donor pool. So these countries are as similar as possible to our DSSI countries. And in that case, you see nothing happens. So it really are the DSSI eligible countries that enjoy the decline in sovereign spreads. And then it comes to what you were saying. The decline we see could be something due to the IMF program. And in fact, one of my co-authors, the paper showing that the IMF program was actually contribute to decline in sovereign spread when you have a program. So here, the sample of treated countries are DSSI ineligible countries, which signed an IMF emergency financing program soon after the DSSI announcement. So therefore in May. As you can see, 0 here, and there is a slide, it's very close to 0. That you can see some decline on average and on median, but it's very, very small. So since we find a much bigger decline, we say this is not due to IMF conditionality, this is due to the DSSI program. So we do different methodologies, synthetic diff in diff. This, as I said, allow us to basically come up with a much cleaner sort of identification and confidence interval. So here we say that the difference between the DSSI eligible countries and synthetic control is 200 basis points, and the difference here between the red and the green or blue line is statistically significant. So we can test for that, and it works. Generalized synthetic control, similar confidence band, it's close to being significant. Bear in mind that n is equal to 18, so clearly confidence bands are large. So the mechanism, one thing is that what happened at the time, I need 2 minutes. What happened at the time, there was and also not only an increase in sovereign spread, but also something happened on liquidity. So we look at, generally we argue in the paper that what happened is a reduction in credit risk, but it will also be something happen on liquidity risk. So we collect data on bid-ask spread on sovereign bonds. We do the same exercise. We don't see anything on liquidity risk going down. There's a lot of data very patchy, but then that suggests that first of all, the decline is a reduction in credit risk. Then what's explained it? We do local projections, and we try to look at liquidity and stigma. To do liquidity, we separate out our 18 countries in those who receive a large DSSI debt relief and those who receive small DSSI debt relief. And also we separate between countries which have a larger share of debt which is due in the short term and others which have a longer term outstanding debt. And again, the sample is very small, so statistically the two lines are overlap, but the effect in the declining spread is much bigger for the countries which receive larger share of debt relief and have a shorter maturity, shorter outstanding debt, suggesting that liquidity really is what seems to drive our results. For the stigma, we separate between countries which have a large share of debt due to private creditors and also countries which actually participate and not participate, because out of 18, not all of them participate. If it were a stigma effect, at least for the countries which participate, and maybe for the countries which owe a lot of debt to the private creditors, we should see spread actually going up. Instead, they go down. So nothing happens here. So we have no effect of stigma. So the question is, can a simple debt moratorium can help countries weather a negative shock? Our answer is yes. So spread goes down, and our results would support design and adoption of very simple state contingent debt instruments, which people have been advocating for a very long time to deal with a lot of the shocks like climate-related shock. Two caveats, and then done. First of all, results are specific to what happened at the time, cannot be generalized to what's happening right now. The crisis has been unfolding in different ways, and now my view at least is that we need debt stock reduction to deal with debt crisis in those countries. And we focus on official NPV neutral debt relief. What happens if private creditors are part of the debt reduction is a question that we leave for further research. Sorry for being a bit longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that presentation. And I think we'll have 10 minutes at the end to ask questions. So I'll delay my questions then. And now I think Monica can share her presentation.
Okay, thank you. Oh. Can you guys see my screen? No. Thank you. Okay, thank you for letting me in the conference, and I think I've seen Andrea before and Costin Fernando. So today I'm going to talk about my research on sovereign debt sustainability and redistribution. So the motivation for this research project comes from a lot of debates that surrounding the European debt crisis and thinking about what kind of policies that help the government reduce its budget when they get into crisis, or thinking about all of these raising taxes or cutting social transfers programs that they help repay the debt, but they may actually have an unequal effect on the domestic economy. You can think about that raising taxes or reducing social welfare programs may hurt the people at the bottom of the income distribution. And so broadly speaking, right, when you think about government thinking about making all of these fiscal policy decisions, they constantly face a trade-off between how much should I commit into trying to repay this debt, or how much should I actually use these resources to try to help the people at the bottom distribution. I think Andrea had the quote there in his presentation as well. And so to sort of look at this trade-off in the data, basically I look at pre-tax income inequality as measure about how much existing inequality that you have in the country versus how much external debt that you actually owe to the external creditors. And if you look at broadly across countries, you can see that these two measures are actually correlated. So you can see there are some tensions going on here for the government to think about these trade-offs. And you can also see it for a lot of the countries that over time, they are also so constantly facing this type of trade-off when their income inequality, pre-tax, and their external debt have been increasing. Okay, so to be more precisely, so this is what I'm looking at, income inequality and external debt across country. On the x-axis here, I have a measure of income inequality, which is the pre-tax Gini index. And on the y-axis here, I have a measure for what I think is external liability for countries. So this is net foreign liability to GDP. And each dot here is the average for each country over the period of 1985 to 2015. And you can see that roughly countries that face on average higher income inequality also face higher level of external debt. In the case of thinking about income inequality and external debt over time, as I said, that happened a lot to a lot of countries, that you see that upward trending in both measures. So specifically, here's the case of Italy. So you can see that periods that are associated with higher, so later on, like after 2002, you see higher level of income inequality that's also associated with higher level of debt. Right, so I'm motivated sort of by these observations. In this paper, I'm basically, my research questions are, first, how does that the fact that you have a country that faces high level of inequality, has some motive for distribution, and wanted to do some helping the poor people, how does that going to affect that country's ability to repay its external debt? And also, what kind of policy should the government think about when they face when they're in bad time, they get hit by recessionary shocks, they have to think about repaying their debt, or should they actually think about redistribution? And in order to answer these two questions, I'm going to build a model that have three key features. The first feature is that I'm going to have heterogeneous agents. Here they are differentiated by labor skills. I'm going to have distortionary taxes as policies for redistribution. And the third key ingredient is that I'm going to have that the government cannot commit to both tax and debt policy. So in the sense, modeling that trade-off between should I set some taxes so that I can try to do more distribution, or should I set taxes in order to help me to repay my debt? And so sort of going back to what I said about the empirical correlation between income inequality and external debt, how should I reconcile both that positive correlation? The idea here is that in this setup, when the government has a motive for distribution, it's actually willing to sustain a high level of external debt. The reason is that when the government has access to external debt, they can use that additional resources to redistribute to the domestic economy through the domestic credit market. And because of that additional redistributive tool, additional resources, the government is able to reduce the level of distortion, labor taxes that are needed for distribution. And why does that matter? Because in the sense of if the government tries to default on this debt, now it becomes very costly because you don't have access to all of these external resources. You don't have access to being able to do more distribution like you want to. And so that sort of discourages the government to actually default and encourages the government to basically try to sustain more debt. Right. And so if you have higher level of pre-tax income inequality, in a sense, it's going to be more costly for you when you go into default. And so that gives you a higher incentive to actually try to sustain this level of debt. And so I'll give you an overview of the results. As I said, that I quantified this mechanism using the data, and I can see that my model is able to generate this cross-country correlation between income inequality and external debt. Also being able to understand that on the long run, if you look at the increases in level of inequality in Italy, the model is able to explain for about this mechanism, I mean, is be able to explain for what you observe in the data, about 70% of what you observe in the data, the increase in the level of external debt. And to back to the second question about what should you do when you get hit in the recessionary shock, especially when you have the presence of inequality and wanted to do redistribution. In the short run, what you would like to do is that you would like to borrow more. Naturally, you would like to borrow more when you get hit with a bad shock. That allows you to do more redistribution as well. But in the long run, in order to basically repay back that debt that you borrow in the short run, you would have to sacrifice your redistribution, or you have to sacrifice equality. This paper relates to the literature on, and a lot of literature, right, on the literature of sovereign debt, thinking about the distributional effect of sovereign debt policy. On the literature on just in general, thinking about both tax and debt management optimally. My contribution is thinking about the case in which the government lacks commitment and cannot commit to both of those policies. And in sub literature, right, that all deals with about, there are a lot of papers nowadays talking about inequality and sovereign debt and default risk. The contribution is basically to quantify that cost of default and the idea that default is costly due to redistribution. Okay, so I'm going to give you basically just because of the time constraint of the talk, I'm going to give you basically a brief overview of the model. Feel free to have any questions afterwards. And so, as I said, it's going to build on 3 key ingredients. So I'm just going to expand them here. Right, so the first key ingredient of heterogeneous household, right? They are different by labor productivity skills. The households here are impatient, so they all want to accumulate debt. Right, so standard preferences over consumption and hours work. So here is labor income divided by their labor productivity. So that's just hours work. The second component is that I'm going to have the tax system here is going to be an affine tax system that acts as a redistributive policy. So let me explain a little bit more about that. So the idea here is that I'm going to have that everybody is going to, regardless of their type, different labor types here, they are going to face a proportional income tax. So think of this like a fixed rate, and they are going to subject to like a fixed, receive a fixed amount or being taken away a fixed amount. So that's this lump sum tax and transfer. And the key feature of this tax system is that, so let me explain a bit here, right? Suppose that I want to redistributing resources from the rich to the poor. What I would do is that I would raise a labor tax rate, like this fixed rate, and then I will give everybody a lump sum transfer. So in that way, the rich guys are the guys that have to pay more taxes compared to the poor guy because he's the one that have higher income. And everybody's subject to the same flat tax rate. And so in that sense, you can think about it as the reason why you would ever raise this flat labor tax rate or creating some distortion in the economy is because you would like to do redistribution. So if you want to raise taxes for revenue, you would just have used this lump sum tax channel instead of raising this distortionary labor taxes. In terms of credit markets, I'm going to have both state contingent, domestic, and external bonds. I make a few assumptions here that the government issues both domestic and external bonds, while the private households, heterogeneous households here can only trade bonds in the domestic credit market. This is just an assumption. The model is actually equivalent to the case in which the private households also have access to the external credit market. And then the last key ingredient is that I assume that the government cannot commit to all of his policies. And I'm going to look at a particular equilibrium. I mean, the term is self-enforcing equilibrium. You can think of it as more like a no default equilibrium, in which if the government deviates from its policies, it's going to lose The simplest thing to think about is that if the government decides to default, it's going to lose access to all of the external credit markets. And I'm going to consider that the case of autarky. This equilibrium allows me to determine the sustainable level of debt. So in a sense of, if I'm looking at the equilibrium, there's no default in equilibrium, but it's basically the equilibrium in which, right, default doesn't happen. So whatever debt that I receive here is basically what will be the level of debt that I can sustain without having to default. And part of this part of equilibrium here is going to give me a condition that I consider as sort of like giving out some endogenous borrowing constraints, in which, I mean, this is the fancy notation, but you can think about it is that this is the continuation utility, which is what will be the utility if you don't default versus what will be the utility if you default and faces an autarky. And these utilities are governed by these welfare weights, which is how much do you care about distribution. And so I want to talk about the main mechanism here into more details about why does greater income inequality actually imply more external debt. It's like sort of preview in the intro. So here I'm going to just focus on two deterministic economies here. Economy one, representative agent, there's no heterogeneity. I'm going to argue that you will not observe any external borrowing at all in equilibrium. Versus economy two, when you have some existing level of inequality and have some motive for distribution, you're going to observe some positive external borrowing in equilibrium. And the argument for economy one, I guess, is in some ways is simple in a sense of if you have any borrowing, so if the government wants to borrow, it will default on any borrowing. And so ex ante, the lenders are going to anticipate these defaults and do not lend at all. And so the idea here is that even if in this economy one, you want to borrow, but the fact that because you're going to default and you don't have any motive for trying to sustain this level of debt, the lenders are going to anticipate that and will not lend you ex ante. So in equilibrium, you're not going to observe any borrowing. But in economy two, the difference here is that now you have some motive for sustaining some debt. And the motive, as I said, coming from the fact that now you can use these additional resources to do redistribution. And that allows you to reduce, like as I said, right, when you want to do distribution, you have to raise distortionary taxes. But now you can have these additional resources to do distribution, so you don't have to raise that much distortionary taxes. And so in some sense, it allows you to, right, in some sense, having access to credit markets allow you to redistribute at a lower cost. Right, so here I sort of show it here, you can see it. So red line here is autarky, and everything else is what would happen if you don't default. And you can see very clearly here that this is the level of labor tax. So think about this as the distortion. When you are not defaulting, right, you enjoy being able to have lower level of labor taxes versus if you are in autarky, you have to raise a very high labor taxes for distribution. Why will you be able to enjoy having lower? Here's level of domestic debt issue by the government. You can think negative here, meaning the households are owing debt. So this is for low income household, and this is for high income households. And you can see that over time, a high income households, because they have higher income, they're going to have higher amount of debt. And so in some sense, what's happening in the domestic credit markets is that you see some sort of wealth redistribution, in a sense of the high income households are becoming more, having fewer assets. So you see that they are having fewer assets comparing to the low income households. And so you see some natural way of redistributing in the domestic credit markets that allowing you to have lower labor taxes. And the only reason why you can do this is because you were actually having all of these external debts redistributed here. Okay, I think I still have time. So let me talk briefly about how I sort of quantify this mechanism in the data.
You have 7 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. The key assumptions here, I have, so the question here is, how do I discipline sort of like, what do you mean by distribution? How do you think about that motive for distribution? And the way that I'm trying to think here is that I'm going to sort of fix the way that the government wants to preferences for distribution, in a sense of, I'm going to have an utilitarian government. And I'm going to discipline everything else with the inequality. So if I have higher inequality, that with just like a utilitarian government, if I have higher inequality, that means the government wants to do more distribution, right? And the reason why it wants to do more distribution is because you have higher level of inequality. So that's sort of like the way that I'm trying to discipline my model here. I'll just, I'm sort of, let me actually, I think, go a little bit more in details. Here is that key moments in my calibration is that I have to discipline about level of inequality in the model. I'm gonna try to use basically using Italian household data to look at the wage of the average top 50% versus the bottom 50% as a discipline for the inequality in my model. And the other key moments in the calibration is that I'm going to use the discount factor to match the average domestic real interest rate. This is very different from the literature. Usually they use this beta in order to match the average level of debt. I'm gonna let average level of debt here as an untargeted moment instead. Right? And so this is what's coming out of the model. So looking at inequality in external debt across countries. Here I'm looking at a cross-country estimation, right? I'm gonna do a data generation process using simulated data from the model. I'm gonna run the regression, like the graph that I showed you about inequality in external debt across countries before. I'm gonna run that regressions on the averages of the pre-tax Gini index and external debt to output. And so the coefficient that you saw in the data in the graph in the beginning this is the coefficient, this is the slope of that linear approximation, in a sense that 1% increase in the pre-tax Gini can account for means that they're about, I guess, 0.9 or about 1% increase that you will observe in the level of external debt. In my model, that translates into actually a much higher increase, about 2.4% increase in percent of increase in the external debt to GDP. The reason I will say why my model generates much higher coefficient comparing to the data is that I think, I have state contingent debts here versus in the data you have non-state contingent debts, you have incomplete markets. So in the sense that there, in the data, there are actually additional reasons of why you will not see a higher level of debt as in the model.
Monica,
Yeah.
could changing the lambda weights of the planner in the model change that coefficient to bring it closer to the data? Moving away from the utilitarian plan.
I don't necessarily, I haven't really checked on that exercise. I'm still working on the coefficient. I could try that, but I honestly don't think it's going to change this coefficient.
Do you have an intuition about why not?
Well, because what this regression does is that like when you change the level of pre-stack Gini, there's an equivalence to, instead of changing pre-tax Gini, changing the planner's weight. Right? Like that's what I'm saying. Like that's why I'm trying to discipline it. It's like, how do you measure redistributive motive? Right? And so if you change pre-tax Gini, it's equivalent to not changing pre-tax Gini and changing that planner weight. But but the reason why I said that I'm not sure is because I think that there may be some nonlinear, a little bit of nonlinear relationship here, is that given a certain planner's weight, maybe changing in the pre-tax Gini has different implication for debt to output. Yeah, thank you. And in the case of thinking about the long run estimate of the model, what I did here is I looked at the data in Italy from 1985 to 2001. So that's the first period of low inequality, low external debt, comparing to the later period in 2002, 2015. I feed it into the model, like the change of the pre-tax Gini. So between those two periods, there's increase in pre-tax income inequality. That's about 3%. So I feed it into model exactly that change. And I show that the model can account for this a bit more, but about 70% of the increase in 600. So just 10% versus 14. A little bit more than 70%. I think this number is a cleaner way to present. And lastly, I want to talk about using the model to think about what if you get hit by a recessionary shock and you have some inequality going on in the economy. All right, going back to that motivation, what should you do in that case when you have all these two competing forces? So here I'm plotting the impulse responses to a negative productivity shock. Blue is the baseline model, and the black ones dashed dot here is the level, the one without the representative agent, so without inequality, right? So output pretty much drop similarly, and same as consumption. What will be different here? I want to focus on this panel C and D is the level of external debt that get increased, and so you can see here that for the blue line, which is the baseline, you can see an increase in level of external debt and a decreasing in external debt over time. Same for the no inequality when you don't have any motive for distribution. The difference here is that you can see that the economy is slowly reducing that level of external debt, so trying to repay this level of debt. And the reason why they are being able to enjoy being able to slowly repaying the debt comparing to the representative agent case is that they are able to exploit that channel of changing how much distribution they want to do. And so in this here, I'm plotting the differences in utility between the two agents in the economy. So if you see a drop, that means right they are getting closer. That means you have more distribution. If it increases, that means you have more distribution. You can see that in the short run, you want to reduce that difference between the two agents' utility. So you want doing more distribution, but in the long run, you want to basically reverse that and actually want to do less distribution in order to repay this debt. Okay, so I will conclude here. So in this paper, I looked at a theory of, I'll develop a theory of thinking about why would countries want to sustain debt, and that might be coming from their motive for distribution. They introduce a new endogenous cost of default that is related to the fact that now if you default and don't have any access to external borrowing, distribution is going to be more costly. And I show that this theory can quantitatively account for basically the correlation between income inequality and external debt across countries or over time.
Thank you very much, Monica. Let me know if you can see my slides. Great. The thank you very much to everybody for being here, and thank you very much for the organizers for accepting my paper. I am Fernando Arce from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and the usual disclaimers that the views presented here are mine and do not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago nor the Federal Reserve System apply. So today I'll be telling you about private overborrowing under sovereign risk. This paper is motivated by the experience of the Spanish sovereign debt crisis of 2012. In particular, both the lead up to this crisis and what happened during the crisis. In the decade that preceded the crisis, Spain was characterized by having a high level of private debt, and at the same time, a low level of public external debt, and an interest rate spread paid on this public debt that was near zero. During the global financial crisis, the Spanish private sector started deleveraging quite fast, and the Spanish economy experienced a severe contraction. The government responded to this crisis with publicly financed bailouts to its banking sector and a series of restructurings. Eventually, the level of external public debt increased, and there was a spike on the interest rate spread paid on public debt. So this is what I'll be showing you in this graph. On the x-axis here, you have time since the creation of the euro up until 2015. And on the y-axis here on the left, you have the net foreign liability position, external, of Spain as a percent of GDP. So you have the private position in blue and the public position in red. On the right-hand side, on the y-axis on the right-hand side, you have the interest rate spread paid on public debt. And you can see what I was telling you. You see this build up during the decade preceding the crisis in private debt, all the while public debt never goes above 20%, and the spread relative to the German counterpart is relatively small and close to zero. After 2008, the growth in private debt starts declining, and the spreads on public debt starts increasing. And this all culminates in 2012, when we observe this quasi-symmetric evolution of the public and private positions that is paired with a spike on the interest rate spread paid on public debt. And the reason why these two objects look so symmetric is not necessarily a mystery. We know that Spain launched two series of restructurings of its financial sector. So there was a direct transfer both from the Treasury and the Bank of Spain towards the financial sector that led to a nationalization of previously private liabilities. But it's not necessarily all that. There was also an overall increase in fiscal expenditure as a result of stimulus packages to deal with the crisis as well. So the purpose of this paper will be to try to build a model that is quantitatively consistent with these facts, both with the lead up to the crisis, but also with the evolution that happens once the crisis started. So what I will be arguing in this paper is that there was excessive private borrowing in the Spanish private sector. And through the lens of my model, I will have a clear definition about what is excessive and what is not. And I will argue this excessive private borrowing increased the probability of experiencing a financial crisis and then a sovereign debt crisis. Because the theory I will present is quantitatively consistent with the data, I'll be able to measure a few things. I'll be able to measure, for instance, that the level of excessive private debt was around 5% of GDP. I can also measure some of the costs associated with this. I will argue that it increased the annual probability of experiencing a financial crisis, defined here as a contraction of more than one standard deviation on the net foreign liability position of the private sector by 2.4 percentage points. And finally, the model will be able to account for around 85% of the spikes on interest rate spreads that we observed in 2012. The key policy implication of the paper will be that in countries where sovereign risk is an issue, that is, in countries where the government cannot commit to repay its debts, the optimal macroprudential tax, that is, the taxes that a government should be imposing on a private sector that is borrowing above what is socially optimal, should be increased and therefore should be more restrictive. I estimate that my calibrated versions that it should be around 0.7 percentage points more restrictive than if sovereign risk wasn't an issue. So what do I actually do? I construct a model with two types of international debt. There will be private bonds that will be controlled by the private sector and that will be subject to a credit friction, specifically a collateral constraint, where the market value of income is where you can only borrow up to a fraction of the market value of income. There will be another internationally issued bond that will be public debt that will be controlled by the government and will be strategically defaultable and will be the tradition of the Eaton-Gossovitz model. I will solve two versions of this model. A baseline or competitive version in which a continuum of competitive households controls the issuances of private debt, and a benevolent government taxes and transfers resources to these households and also controls the decisions on public borrowing and the default decisions on public debt. I will contrast and compare this version with a socially planned version in which we only have a benevolent planner that makes all of the aggregate borrowing decisions for the country as a whole, solves the optimal portfolio problem in the issuances of these two assets, and then lump sums the proceeds of this external borrowing to the households that make the consumption choices. Crucially, the social planner will be facing exactly the same constraints as the households and the government in the previous version. That is, when using the private bond, it will be subject exactly to the same collateral constraint. And when using the public bond, it will also lack commitment and be able to default and suffer exactly the same punishments as the government in the baseline version. Comparing these two versions of my model, I find that there is higher private borrowing in the baseline version relative to the socially planned version. There is also a higher probability of experiencing a financial crisis, and that conditional on experiencing a financial crisis, that is an episode in which this collateral constraint on private debt is binding, and therefore the current account of the private sector is increasing, the government has an incentive to bail out the private sector, that is, issue public debt to transfer resources to the households. This will relax the collateral constraint and help the households in time of crisis, but this response of the government will lead to a higher incidence of public debt in the baseline version, and therefore a higher frequency of sovereign debt crisis in the baseline version relative to the socially planned version. I will also show theoretically that the allocations that solve the social planner problem could be implemented if we give the government in the baseline version access to a state contingent tax on private debt that would allow the government to control the private borrowing decisions of the households. This model contributes to three strands of the literature. There is a literature that now interests on the interactions between sovereign default and private debt. The difference with these papers is that in my model, the issuances of private debt will be inefficient from a social point of view, and will also be done externally. This model also speaks to the literature about financial crisis and government interventions, specifically to the bailouts literature. In my model, the bailouts will be financed with debt, meaning that the costs do not have to be the cost of the bailouts do not have to be raised within period. So there's no bailouts can be financed with debt, but also this debt is issued without commitment, meaning that the government can default on this debt. And finally, my model speaks also to the literature on doom loops that studies the relationship between sovereign debt crisis and financial sector crisis, and specifically quantifies one of the channels of these loops, the channel that goes from crisis in the private sector to crisis in the public sector. My model, I will only have this part of the doom loop, but I will be able to provide quantitative estimates for this part. And in that sense, it's a complement to papers like Bukola 2016 that quantify the other leg of the loop. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump to the model. I have a model with a small open endowment economy. There will be two goods in this economy, tradables and non-tradables. All bonds will be denominated in units of tradables. And the key price that will be key for the mechanism of the paper will be the real exchange rate, this relative price of non-tradables in terms of tradables, and will play a key role in the mechanism. There will be three aggregate shocks: an income shock to the endowment of tradables, and two types of financial shock: a financial shock kappa that will directly hit the collateral constraint of the households, and a private default shock that will affect the spreads that the households are paying on their own private debt. There will be three agents in this baseline version of the model: a benevolent government, a continuum of competitive households, and a continuum of risk-neutral deep-pocketed foreign lenders that will be pricing the assets issued by both the government and the households. The timing within the period is as follows. First, the external shocks are realized, and they will be summarized by little s. Then the government makes the public default and borrowing decisions strategically, that is taking into account how its decisions will affect the households and the lenders. Then the households will make their consumption and private borrowing decisions competitive. Finally, the lenders will price both assets and the markets will clear. The richness of the model comes from the asset structure. And here I will spend a little bit more time explaining to you what are the objects that I'll be using. So there will be public debt, and it will be denoted by big L. This will be a long-term bond. Specifically, will be a perpetuity with an exponential decay delta. It will be strategically defaultable. So the government can choose period by period if it wants to default or not. And as a result, it will be issued at a spread, therefore with a price big Q. There's also a private bond that the aggregate stock of which will be denoted by big B. It will be of a shorter maturity. It will be one period debt. An exogenous fraction of each, an exogenous fraction of pi will be defaulted on each period, and therefore it would also be issued with a spread, and its price will be denoted by a small q. But more importantly, it will be subject to a collateral constraint. That is, the market value of private debt issuance will have to be smaller or equal than a fraction kappa, that would also be another exogenous shock, of the current income. And this key friction is going to be crucial for understanding the interactions between private and public debt. Okay, so within a period, what happens? So the government wakes up and observes the exogenous state of the economy and the two endogenous states, the initial level of aggregate private debt and the initial level of aggregate public debt. The government needs to make two decisions. It needs to decide whether or not it wants to default on the public debt. And if it decides to repay the public debt, then it has to decide how much public debt to finish the period with, how much public debt to issue, therefore. So the default decision in the model will be binary. It will be a complete default or full repayment, and the government will lose access to international credit markets in case of default. On top of that, it would also be suffering a punishment. And I'm borrowing from the Eaton Gonzalez tradition, Arellano or Hachondo and Martinez papers. The government has also to satisfy a period budget constraint, period by period, that pins down the transfers that the government can make to the households. So if the government decides to default, the transfers and taxes to the households are zero. But if the government decides to repay, then these transfers can be both positive and negative. If the government is repaying its debts, meaning that this L prime, it will be smaller than the initial L that we started the period with, these transfers will be negative, meaning that the government will be taxing the households in order to repay its external debt. Now, the government needs to do this from time to time, otherwise nobody will lend them money. But alternatively, the government could decide that this time it should increase the stock of public debt. And if the price of this public debt doesn't move too much against the government, then the households will be receiving a positive transfer from the government. And this is what I will be calling bailouts through the lens of my model. The rest of the structure comes from the fact that these bonds are long-term, but the pricing of these bonds and the repayment and default problems of the government follow closely to what is standard in the sovereign default literature. After the government has played, it's the turn of the households, and the households observe the government's decisions in terms of default and public borrowing and have to make their own decisions. As I said, the households are competitive and part of a continuum of identical households. So they have an individual level of private debt on top of the aggregate state of the economy. They have to decide how much to consume in terms of tradables and non-tradables, and how much individual private debt they want to issue. For that, they have to satisfy a budget constraint. That is, they have to pay for their consumption of tradables and non-tradables, and they have to repay a fraction 1 minus pi of their initial level of private debt. They can use for this their endowment that they received this period. They can issue new private debt, and they can also use the transfers they receive from the government. If they decide to issue new private debt, they have to satisfy the collateral constraint of the collateral constraint that I presented before. That is, the market value of new debt has to be smaller than a fraction kappa of the market value of current income. As I said, the households are competitive, and as a result, they will be taking all of the aggregate prices and all of the aggregate laws of motions of all of these endogenous states as given. In particular, they will be taking as given this real exchange rate, this price of non-tradables. And because this price of non-tradables appears both on the budget constraint of the households and the collateral constraint, they will be this would generate the standard pecuniary aggregate demand externality that leads to overborrowing, and it's common on the sudden stop literature. But this will not be the only aggregate thing that the aggregate function that the households take as given. They will also be taking as given the effect of their borrowing decisions on future government policies. And this is a novelty of the paper. The households do not internalize that their borrowing decisions are changing the probabilities of a default in the future, of a sovereign default in the future, and also the borrowing behavior of the government in the future. This will be key for the novelty of the mechanism. Importantly, this also means that I will not have moral hazard because each of my households is small. It does not internalize that, and it's actually correct in not internalizing this, that its borrowing decisions are affecting the government policies, because government policies are only a function of aggregates, and none of them is big enough to affect aggregates. Other than that, the definition of equilibrium is a standard. The government optimizes, the households optimize, and the lenders optimally price the assets issued by the private sector and public sector, and the market's clear. In equilibrium, the key price, as I said, is this real exchange rate, the relative price of non-tradables, and it will be pinned down by the marginal rate of substitution between tradables and non-tradables. What matters is that in equilibrium, it will be an increasing function of the aggregate consumption of tradables. The specific functional form depends on the functional form assumptions that I make for the utility function, but what matters is that this price is increasing in the consumption of tradables, and this is something that will be key to understanding how the mechanism of the model works. The social planner problem looks exactly the same. There's exactly the same three aggregate shocks, but this time there's just the planners and the lenders who are pricing their assets. The states are also the same two endogenous states. There's an initial level of private bonds, an initial level of public bonds, and the planner has to respect the collateral constraint. The key difference is that the planner does control aggregates and therefore controls the aggregate consumption of tradables and internalizes that its consumption of tradables decisions are going to affect the price that the right-hand side of its collateral constraint and this relative price of non-tradables. Other than that, the planner will make aggregate choices, but will take the prices of the bonds as given. And the foreign lenders will price the assets issued by the planner as well. So why do the baseline and socially planner allocations differ? Well, as I've been saying, the households are ignoring two general equilibrium effects. The first one that is a standard in the literature is this pecuniary externality. The collateral value depends on prices, and this leads to overborrowing. Why it leads to overborrowing? Well, because the households borrow a lot today, which lowers consumption of tradables tomorrow, because this private debt has to be repaid tomorrow. Since the consumption of tradables tomorrow is small, this decreases the value of the real exchange rate tomorrow. This lowers this price and therefore tightens a little bit the collateral constraint. As a result, the collateral constraint is going to bind more frequently. A planner internalizes this and decides to borrow a little bit less, and therefore the constraint binds less frequently. This externality is standard in the SunStop literature and was developed by Mendoza 2002 and Bianchi 2011. The novelty here, the new effect, is how this interacts with government policies. What's going to happen here is that this excessive private borrowing is also going to change the price of government debt, the big Q. Why? And that is because, as I said, in the baseline version of the model, the collateral constraint will be binding more frequently. And I will show you that when the collateral constraint of the private sector is binding, it's optimal for the government to bail them out. That is to issue public debt and transfer those resources to the household. But because the collateral constraint is binding more frequently on the baseline model, the government ends up issuing more public debt and therefore, as a result, ends up defaulting more frequently. And the lenders internalize this. The lenders internalize that lending to the government in the baseline version carries a higher risk because this government needs to bail out its private sector more frequently, and therefore charge them a different schedule and increases the whole cost of sovereign debt. Now, why do the government wants to bail out the households when the collateral constraint binds? Well, this is because when the collateral constraint is binding, the public bailouts with finance with public debt increase consumption via two channels. This is at a time in which the households are not on the Euler equation. That's why the collateral constraint is binding, and therefore increasing the consumption of tradables is beneficial. So there's obviously the first direct channel. They receive transfers from the government that allows them to consume more. But this increase in their consumption of tradables in the current period will also increase the relative price of non-tradables, the real exchange rate, currently, because as I said, this price of non-tradables is an increasing function of the consumption of tradables. This will increase the value of the current collateral, and this will allow to relax the borrowing limit of the households, and they themselves will borrow a little bit more, which will allow them to further increase their consumption. So the consumption of tradables will increase via two channels, thanks to these government bailouts. This is why it is optimal for the government to bail out the households during a private crisis. And this response is optimal. And by the way, the social planner also takes advantage of this asset in exactly the same way. The only difference is that the social planner has to do this less frequently because its collateral constraint is not binding that often. Finally, the only theoretical contribution of the paper is to show that the allocations that solve the social planner problem could be implemented if I have access to, if I give the government access to state contingent taxes on private debt, and this is the formula that these taxes will take. I should note that this is only one implementation of this allocation of the social planner, and I do talk about more realistic implementations in other papers as well. So the quantitative analysis. I calibrate the model to the experience of Spain, to the pre-crisis years, from the creation of the euro to 2011. I discretize income, the private default shock, and the financial shock. I use this dynamic discrete choice method, a la Dworkin and co-authors from 2020. An implication of targeting these years is, as if you remember the graph that I showed you in the beginning, is that the spreads I will be targeting are very low. During this period, Spain had near zero spreads, but I want the model to be able to replicate that as well. So I will calibrate the baseline version of the model to this time period, and I will then use those calibrated parameters to solve the socially planned version of the model and compare the two versions. I will then simulate the 2012 Spanish crisis to see how does the model behave, and I will also tell you about how my optimal macroprudential policies look like. Okay, so the first thing is I calibrate the model, the baseline model, and as you can see, I can match the averages levels of private debt, public debt, and the interest rate spread paid on public debt. Using those calibrated parameters to solve the socially planner version of the model, I find the excessive private borrowing that I said. This is the 5% that I told you in the beginning. I can also show you that the probability of a financial crisis increases in the baseline version relative to the socially planned version. These are annual probabilities. The model is calibrated to annual data. You can also see that the spreads paid on public debt are higher in the baseline version relative to the socially planned version. And as a result, you can also see that there are welfare gains from moving from the baseline version to the socially planned versions that are computed here in terms of consumption equivalence. The second exercise that I do is simulating the 2012 crisis. For this, I feed to the model the exogenous shocks taken from the data to compute the model dynamics. I take directly the income and private default shocks from the data, and I use the particle filter method developed by Bocola and Ovis to try to back out from the data the financial shock. And then I plot the dynamics of public debt, private debt, and the interest rate spread. So that's what I'm doing here. The first panel is the evolution of private debt between 2008 and 2015. The second one is of public debt, and the third one is of the interest rate spread. So in black, you have the data. In red, you have the baseline version of the model, and in blue, you have the socially planned version of the model. You can see that the model can replicate the symmetric evolution of private and public debt. In 2012, private debt collapses. There's a spike in public debt, and that coincides with a spike on the interest rate spread, around 85% of the spreads that we observe in the data. The social planner, on the other hand, is able to completely avoid the crisis through a combination of lower private debt in the lead up to the crisis, but also lower public debt once the crisis starts. And as a result, the interest rate spread of the planner remain close to zero throughout the period. The key consequence for macroprudential policy of this paper is that, if you remember, I showed you in the proposition that there is a positive optimal tax on private debt that can implement the planner's allocation. But this result that the social plan allocations can be implemented is not I'm not the first one to state it. It's also common in a version of my model without the public sector, that is nested in the model. This is the standard model of Bianchi 2011. And the difference with that model is that here, in the model I'm presenting you today, financial crisis can lead to this sovereign debt crisis, and this is how this adds an additional cost to the excessive level of private borrowing. That is, excessive private borrowing not only is bad on itself, but also is bad because it can increase the probability of having a sovereign debt crisis. And the key policy implication is this means that if you are in this state, you want a higher level of taxes on private debt than you would need in an environment in which the government cannot default. And this is what I will be showing you next. So this is the distribution of taxes on private debt that implement the social planner allocations in my model, at the ergodic distribution. In red, this is the distribution of tax, sorry, the ergodic distribution. I compare that to the optimal taxes that implement the social planner allocations in a version of my model without the government, but only the households issuing private debt. And this is exactly Bianchi 2011. And you can see that in that model, you also need taxes to implement the social planner allocations, but you need less of them. Specifically, on average, you need 0.7% less taxes in that model than in my model. So that is if you take into account that that sovereign debt is issued with a risk, then you need to be more restrictive and tighten your macroprudential policies. That is the key implication, policy implication of the model. To conclude,
Fernando,
sorry, yes, go ahead.
Do you know why you have a bit of a spike on 0?
Yes, so both versions of the model have a mass at 0. That is because when the collateral constraint is binding, the optimal macroprudential tax is 0. When the collateral constraint is binding, you do not want to tighten it even more. So what is optimal to do is to actually bring this tax to 0. And this is true both in my model and in Bianchi 2011. That's the difference is that, as you can see in my model, that seems to happen more frequently. There's a higher frequency of a binding collateral constraint. That's why I have more of a mass at 0. Okay, so to conclude, this is a simple model about how financial crisis, that is crisis in the private sector, can lead to sovereign debt crisis. In the model, the way it works is the private sector borrows above what is socially optimal. This increases the probability of experiencing a financial crisis, that is a moment where the collateral constraint of the private sector is binding and the consumption contracts. The model endogenously generates this symmetric evolution of private and public debt positions. And this increases the probability of experiencing a sovereign debt crisis, that is a spike on the interest rate spread or potentially a sovereign default. The model is quantitatively consistent with the Spanish data. It allows me to measure the level of private overborrowing and its costs, how much it increases the probability of a crisis. And the key policy recommendation is if you are in a country where sovereign risk is an issue, then you may need more restrictive macroprudential policies. A secondary policy recommendation is that, at least through the lens of my model, the optimal policy response in these circumstances combines both preventive and remedial measures. The preventive measures are these taxes that are only positive during good times. That is when the collateral constraint is not binding. You tax the private sector to limit the amount of private borrowing that you do to prevent the possibility of having a financial crisis. But I also find that there is a role for remedial measures. That I also find that having access to this to bailouts financed by public debt once a crisis happens also increases welfare. So I find a role for both preventive and remedial measures. Thank you very much for your time, and we now have 10 minutes to take questions, but they don't have to be about my paper. I also have some questions about the 2 other papers that were presented. So I'll stop sharing my slides.
So maybe can I go first?
Sure.
No, I as you can see, like I'm not the theory guy here, but I still like to understand something from Monica's paper. So am I right in saying that in your case, like, you take inequality as a given, and so it's a story about, like, given the inequality, then there are like different for distribution, and then you explain the accumulation of debt.
Yeah.
If this is the case, does your model say anything? It's what's going to happen to R? Like there is all this discussion about, like, I'm thinking about Mian and Sufi's paper and all that kind of literature. So can you say something about, like, what's happening to R? Because R, in some sense, if that goes up, then borrowing costs at some point should go up. But then inequality also affects. I don't know if you can speak to that discussion or not.
I'm not.
And then the other question is, like, why you focus on external debt rather than on public debt more generally? I didn't get that intuition.
Yeah, I'm looking at basically is net. I think the more precise term is the net international investment position.
Okay.
I think that's a better match with my model, because in my model, I mean, at the end of the day is like both, like if suppose if both private and the governments are borrowing as well. So so and really that external debt that I have in my model is basically right the opposite of or negative of the net international investment position. Yeah, so that's what I mean by external debt. Actually, it's not just external debt by the government, but it's the whole country. Yeah. And talking and yeah, in your R, my model is quite silent about that. I guess the only way that I speak a little bit of the R is that when I calibrate the model with the discount factor, is using the domestic interest rates. So in some sense, it's capturing sort of like that friction between how borrowing abroad is in some way a little bit cheaper than borrowing domestically. So, but I'm not really talking about that evolution or what would happen if the R changes. Yeah, but I think to the extent of borrowing costs is that beta that I have. I have a question for Andrea, if that's okay.
Of course.
I was thinking, you have some countries in your data set, I mean your overall data set, that is subject to that are eligible for the relief fund, but they don't really borrow abroad. I was wondering if you sort of can use that data to see the impact of the impact of the policy on maybe other like macroeconomic factors of the country, and use that as a control to think about how much of the reducing in spread is because of the improvements in the fundamentals, or is improvements just on the confidence of the international creditors.
I guess, that's a good point. I guess now we look at borrowing costs simply because, we want to have like a short window around the policy. So it's not that you can see much in terms of macro, but I guess like in due time, yes, one could try to see and see also more macro stuff, although it's pretty hard. So I know the literature on earlier debt relief. People have been trying to show one way or the other that debt relief is good or bad, and it's very, very complicated. But yeah, one could try and see. Yeah, it's a good point. I guess maybe.
Yeah, I had a similar question for you, Andrea, on similar events. Actually, it's two. One of them is like, if you could make the link to the previous literature on debt relief, especially with like the HIPC countries, where I, from my reading of that literature, was actually that there wasn't actually that many gains. And then my second question was that you have in your sample some countries for which the cost of joining this program is lower than others, because some of them were already in a loan from the IMF, whereas other ones would have to take a loan from the IMF to enter this program. And I feel like we should try to exploit that heterogeneity to see if there was a difference for those two types of countries. Now maybe the sample is too small to observe any meaningful difference, but I feel like that does create a differentiation, and may also explain why some countries did not enter and others entered.
That's actually a very good suggestion, that we haven't done that. I don't know how the split is among the 18, but it's definitely worth doing, because you can actually see, yes, it's probably the only cost that they have to support, given that the other are really minimal. On relating to the HIPC, it's we do that in the sense that my reading of that is, the HIPC was not very successful, and I don't see very, very convincing paper. The only one is more this paper that look more at financial market, like the Ristad paper show that, but then it's a very indirect channel, because if I remember well, I look at stock market values of firms which are quoted in South Africa, but which are headquartered somewhere in some African countries got HIPC. So, we're talking about a few large corporations. So it's and the macro one, it's not. I think the only thing is that if I go back 1 year, the sort of the provision of that, of at least of the moratorium was relatively fast, and so the international community reacted much more faster than HIPC. If I see the situation right now, it seems more and more it's sort of shaping into HIPC, in which you provide, you have one solution, you extend, you roll over, and the HIPC was like different tears which has been rolled over up to a point in which you need the Pope and someone to say, okay, let's provide that release. And hopefully it will not be the same this time around.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, I think the session is ending. We
Yeah.
change the host. So I don't know if you have any other questions.
No, not on my side. I think that the paper is interesting, but I know I don't get too much into the technicalities of the model. But I think it's, there is a lot of empirical literature on interaction between public and private. So it would be nice because then clearly all the macro paper, all these theory papers that calibrate on a country. But it would be nice sometimes to then see more on, if you can at least borrow some macro as fact on this public-private interaction. And if you go beyond like the Spanish crisis and see if you can say it a bit more.
No, you're absolutely right. And there is like a very big empirical salient fact that there's like a big correlation between the CDSs of private and public debt. Unfortunately, yes, I haven't encountered a good macro model that can microfound that interaction, but maybe there is, it's out there, or maybe I'm not smart enough to think about it. But
yeah, but there are these people that it's not very clear, at least to me, like who is coming first. No, if it's this idea that it's a public increase because they have to bail out the private, or the other way around. So
no, yeah, there's definitely a chicken and egg. Ideally, you would want to have a model that can actually do both things at the same time, and then let the data tell you which one is more salient. But yeah, I've only seen models in one direction or the other one, and then it gets tricky. But that's definitely the goal. That's definitely on the agenda. So that's a very good suggestion, Andrea. Thank you.
okay. Good.